I'm Radia Gleese. I'm a certified clinical nutritionist, and welcome to The Natural Way. I'm here today with Ron Manzanero at Austin Integrative Medicine, and we are going to be talking with Ron about chelation. So, hello Ron, how are you? Tell us, what is chelation?
Chelation refers to a type of therapy where we administer natural compounds or approved pharmaceutical compounds that will bind to toxic metals like lead, mercury, arsenic, aluminum. And these metals can disrupt all sorts of enzyme pathways in the body and can also be associated with brain disorders, brain dysfunction disorders, particularly in pediatrics or in Alzheimer's and many other things, chronic fatigue syndrome. So what we do with chelation, we administer these chelation medicines, which could be something like EDTA or DMSA or DMPS. You hear these types of acronyms, and they will go throughout the body into the connective tissue, the bone marrow, fat stores, and start pulling out these toxic metals.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, most people who hear about chelation, they don't really know what it's about, but they know, they've heard they do it intravenously or they do it orally, and they don't really know. They hear terms like EDTA or DMSA, and they don't know what that is. So they think you're putting some toxic chemical in my body. So can you tell us a little bit about these agents and how they're used?
Well, the interesting thing is that there are chelating substances, and again, the word chelation means to bind, to grab onto. So there are chelating substances which come from natural foods like garlic and cilantro. So when we do oral chelation, which I do a lot of as support to my IV therapy, I will put people on supplements that will contain these elements in them. So I want people to understand that chelation doesn't necessarily mean we're administering some toxic drug, okay? Now, when we administer EDTA, which has been around since the late 1940s, actually, but it wasn't used clinically until the late 50s and mostly in the early 60s when there was a lot of studies done on cardiovascular disease. EDTA is actually 4 acetic acid molecules. That's a fancy word for vinegar that are hooked together by a central core protein in it. Okay, and it has a highly electromagnetic charge for things like lead. And lead is indeed its primary affinity toxic metal. So if someone has lead toxicity, EDTA is the FDA, quote, drug of choice. And it can be administered intravenously or as an oral preparation in a capsule. And believe it or not, calcium EDTA is even used as a preservative, because it's a very strong antioxidant, in canned vegetables. So next time you see some canned green beans at the grocery store, pick it up, you'll see calcium EDTA.
So why does someone need chelation, and who would be likely candidates to go through a chelation process?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, my perspective is we're born in utero in a pristine environment, hopefully. Then we're thrust into the world, and over a lifetime, several decades of living, not only are we eating bad things, but we're eating foods that may be contaminated with toxic metals like mercury, lead, and so on. Okay, we also absorb these toxic metals from the atmosphere. Now, why is this bad? Well, for one thing, the original EDTA chelation studies were done in the 1960s for coronary artery disease. And over 90% of those people in those studies actually had marked improvement of their angina symptoms. We now know what EDTA is doing. It's removing lead from the arterial walls, and the arteries, when they start accumulating lead, will constrict down. There is actually publications on this. The AMA Journal in 2003 had an article on lead and its relationship to hypertension in women who are going into menopause. And what they found was that as women go into menopause, their bones begin to thin, and guess where we've stored lead all these years, for maybe 3 or 4 decades? In the bone marrow. So now as the bones are thinning because of osteopenia and osteoporosis, the lead is gradually, in low doses, not toxic doses that are going to knock you out and make you unconscious, but low doses every day that cause the arteries to constrict down. And as you know, when you try to suck through a tiny straw, it requires more pressure than if you're sucking through a big straw. So now the heart has to pump harder through those tiny arteries. That is one benefit of chelation, to get the lead out of the arteries. We also know that lead is a problem with children and learning disorders. Also mercury. Recent study out of Ohio State Medical Center in their atherosclerosis lab from last year demonstrated they found that mercury triggers an enzyme that will actually promote plaque formation in the arteries. So those are some good reasons why to get chelated and get these toxic metals out of your body. But in general, they are, in many cases, they're oxidizing, They will promote the cholesterol oxidizing in the arteries. They also are enzyme disruptors. And I think if someone wants to get to a level of optimal health, we need to start getting this stuff out, whether we do it through intravenous or oral chelation, and even using the more natural substances along with it to support that.
What are some of the conditions that typically you would use chelation for?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's actually a very broad question. Chelation, traditionally, when it was first used, it was done by the Navy for lead poisoning in the late 1950s. They had men working on the ships painting, and they were using leaded paint, so they got lead toxic. But it began to broaden in clinical experience around the early 1960s, and it was being used, and it was marketed for by Abbott Laboratory, which had the original patent on it for cardiovascular disease and angina. So you'll still see the vast majority of people coming in for cardiovascular disease. And the alternative to that these days is to get an angioplasty or a bypass surgery, and that's what's considered mainstream, or maybe just treating with medications. And certainly they have their place in therapy. However, many people don't want to go straight to a bypass surgery. It's frightening to them. It has certain potential side effects, including death from the operation itself, right? So if you can expand the arteries and cause some extra dilation of the arteries through something like EDTA, which, as we mentioned before, lead causes constriction of arteries. So by getting those minute doses of lead out of the arteries, you cause that vasodilatation, you get better perfusion of the arteries. For some people, their angina symptoms will go away. So that's a very common use. There are other uses. These days, we're using it for children with autism, people with Alzheimer's disease, because we know that there is some association perhaps more with mercury, but we also know with lead toxicity and learning disorders that these issues are related to toxic metals, and chelation will have a role there. I do have a lot of people that come in as a matter of general wellness. They want to start detoxifying their body from toxic metals of all kinds. It's not just lead and mercury. We're talking cadmium, arsenic, and aluminum. And we get exposure from a broad source of these toxic metals just from day-to-day living, from breathing it in the atmosphere. Particularly lead and mercury are in the atmosphere as a result of coal tar burning plants. People for many decades and still presently are using aluminum cookware, and they're getting some aluminum into their system that way.
And what are some other conditions that people would typically use chelation for?
Well, we get some people who come in with neuromuscular disorders. These are people who have maybe unusual twitches or weakness in their muscles, and they've been through the gamut of neurologic workup. Everything comes back normal. I had one gentleman who had severe problems with this, and when we checked his lead levels, he had extremely high lead levels. So someone like that could benefit from chelation. Other people just have brain fog. They feel they can't get their cognitive functioning up to where it should be. And of course, there could be other things that are related to that, but chelation could have a role as well in terms of detoxification and helping central nervous system function to be optimal. It's part of a whole program for those types of disorders. I don't want to say that all you have to do is get the lead out of your system, so to speak, or get mercury out of your body, and these type of neurologic problems are going to get better. There may be isolated cases like that. I want people to understand that chelation needs to be viewed as part of a total body package of a complete wellness program, so to speak. So we may do other IV therapies, or we may do other nutritional or supportive therapies. In some cases, we may even use medications. So I think there is a benefit. The more you can get these toxic metals out of your body, I don't care what your issue is, what kind of medical condition, it's not healthy. You'll never achieve optimal health as long as these toxic metals are sitting in your bone marrow and your connective tissue and slowly leaching out into your bloodstream and affecting other parts of the body.
Now, Ron, you're an actual medical doctor, and I know that some medical doctors don't use chelation or don't believe it. They don't use it in their practice. It's somewhat controversial. So what is the actual medical evidence for chelation?
Well, you have to understand oxidation and its role in the body, number one. There's a lot of basic science studies on toxic metals and how they cause cellular dysfunction, cardiovascular dysfunction. I can point to a couple. There are journal studies that were published back in the 1960s that clearly demonstrated the benefits of chelation. But more recently, out of Circulation Journal from 2006, they showed that environmental lead actually is a key determining factor for cardiovascular mortality, not just morbidity, which means you get ill and you're sick, but mortality, that's death. I found it surprising that nowhere in that article did they ever mention how you get rid of the lead levels. And they were actually calling for a lowering of the so-called normal range of lead. So that is an article that does point to that lead from the environment, which we inhale, does have a negative impact on the body. Okay? Also, I mentioned earlier that the AMA Journal in 2003 did this osteoporosis study showing that as women went into osteoporosis and into menopause, those who were in the upper half of the so-called normal lead ranges had a higher incident rate of having hypertension. And again, they realized, and they discussed it very thoroughly, how lead inhibits enzymes which would otherwise relax the arteries. Lead inhibits that activity, so it keeps the arteries a little stiffer, a little more tight. And again, I'm puzzled as to why conventional medicine doesn't want to look at that. So the first thing we want to do is throw a blood pressure pill at you, as opposed to looking at the whole organism from a biological perspective. Another study that points to the benefits of chelation would be like the Ohio State Medical Center article that came out last year, showing that mercury can trigger an enzyme which will activate plaque formation. Now, to the actual mechanics of that, I don't know if we know the specific biochemistry, but we know that these toxic metals lead to dysfunction at multiple levels. It's not even debatable with pediatrics and learning disorders and brain dysfunction, but now we're finding that it is related to cardiovascular blood vessel wall dysfunction. And you're going to find a whole host of other things. So the real issue then is, do we ignore this basic science research, or do we go ahead and start doing a therapy that's been around since the late 1950s, which has been proven to be safe? I will add this too. There was a New England Journal of Medicine article that came out again in 2003, showing that people who had moderate renal disease, this is kidney dysfunction, not due to diabetes, actually had marked improvement of their kidney dysfunction through repeated chelation therapy.
So, Ron, where do we find more information about chelation and more information about you?
One place people can get good information is go to the American College for the Advancement of Medicine. That's www.acam.org. That's the main body that trains doctors to do chelation. Now, if they're here in Austin, they can also go to my website, which is Austin Integrative Medicine, or AIMMD.com. I have some articles that I've written that are on the web, and of course they can also make an appointment, come here and meet us. And if they actually do get the evaluation with me, I'm going to give them some articles, and we're going to have a one-to-one talk just like we're doing now. And we'll go over the pros and cons of the treatment.
So thank you, Dr. Manzanero, for enlightening us on chelation. You've given us some great information today.
Thank you.
Well, that concludes The Natural Way for today. Be sure that you stay tuned for coming episodes. We're going to be interviewing other practitioners in alternative medicine, from acupuncture, herbologists, certified clinical nutritionists like myself, and all kinds. And please feel free to make comments. Make sure that you subscribe and send in your comments of what other kinds of practitioners or alternative medicine you'd be interested in hearing about. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
If you liked this video, we have hundreds of more alternative videos ranging from sexual health to psychology to mind control. So if you liked it, go ahead and click on me to enter the Psyche Truth channel.